You mentioned earlier that you wanted fighters and that you think you would have enjoyed fighters, and of course that didn't happen. But do you think that there is a difference in sort of mindset then amongst U-2 pilots because you fly as singletons? So one of the things, if you talk to a fighter guy and you ask them what their challenges were in their first couple of years of flying operationally, they'll say things like, well, maintaining SA, keeping sight of my flight lead, being a good wingman, just basically just hanging on in there. And I guess then if you're in and then you sort of make that a 4-ship and now it's an 8-ship and then you're doing 16-ship wall of Eagles, whatever.
Yeah.
Now from a U2 point of view, it's just you. And I guess there are sort of parallels there with the old F-117 pilots where
Sure.
they would take off, they'd go fly a route, and it would just be really them. Does that change the way that you are as a pilot? Does it mean that the culture your community has is different to maybe the culture that a more sort of group focused aircraft or weapon system would have?
Yeah, I think the culture, there's a culture there, and it is very specific, I think, to the U2, and people that come there, become a part of the culture. I think it does change you in some respects. People could argue that with me. Your point about large force exercises and what the fighter guys do, and I've never flown, I've never been a qualified fighter pilot. I've gotten rides in the aircraft, and I've gotten just a glimpse at what they do. Flying along on a 4-ship or a 4v4. I've gotten to tag along quite a few flights, actually. It's been a lot of fun. And it's a huge learning opportunity too. But when I come back, I look at the complexity of the missions that the men and women that fly fighters do. It's impressive, and it's hard. And there's some aspects of what they do that I think are just would be incredibly difficult. And those are a little bit different maybe than what we have. Although, again, a lot of things have changed in the U-2 world, and now we find ourselves integrating into these large force packages. When I was the commander during the Second Gulf War over in Saudi Arabia, we would go to the mission brief, 40 aircraft, and we're and a lot of our defense, a lot of the folks that were we have maybe a 4-ship of Eagles and a 4-ship of Vipers that were up there pretty much dedicated to protecting us as we're moving up into Iraqi airspace. And we can't see them, but we are working, we're working the timings. We're out in the orbit. We have to make sure we come in and hit our timings at the right time, because they're all planning their big push into the country at the exact same time. So that was, again, a big community change for us. We had always been just, hey, we go when we go, we go when we want, and we show up there and we fly the black line. And now it's not flying just the black line. We're having to make sure our timings are perfect, and we having to communicate with the right people and pass the right codes and talk to the fighters that are trying to save our bacon if things get ugly. So a lot of that same mentality has a lot of the same concerns and a lot of the same considerations and workloads have moved our direction from the other communities, the bomber community, the fighter community. So again, I think it's different depending on where you're at, but I'm kind of jumping around this, but the culture is specific to the U-2. It's certainly not a fighter culture. It's not a heavy culture, not a bomber culture. But I think a lot of the skill sets that we've used over the last few years have grown quite a bit from just the mentality of by yourself on the black line. Everybody leave me alone. I don't care what's going on around me. To we are now part of a 40-ship package, and that's just the way it is in today's Air Force. And it's either grow with it or you're going to be obsolete tomorrow.
You've mentioned a succession of combat theatres that you've flown in. How much combat time do you have?
I don't know. If I have no idea. A few hundred hours. I mean, I've been fortunate. I got to fly the opening. I got to fly one of the opening U-2 missions on the first day of the first Gulf War. I flew the opening day of the second Gulf War, and I flew the opening night of Bosnia. So I was actually in the orbit when everything started kicking off in Bosnia. That was. They have no missile threat that can touch us, and they really have no credible air threat. So I was just basically sitting in the orbit, with the best view in the house, and just literally watching, things start to shoot off and things blow up, and very, very dramatic, and a very eerie feeling to know that, hey, nobody can touch you. You sit up here all the whole time, and yeah, it was a very, very unusual feeling. But But yeah, I've just been fortunate in my timing. I've been able to go fly in a lot of different theaters, and I've been there at the right time to be able to go fly on day one.
What's the most uncomfortable you've been then in that sense, with regards to, maybe somebody shooting at you or locking you up, or having to go closer to something than maybe you want to?
Uh, you know, that first day of Desert Storm, that mission I was flying right up around. If you remember, look at the old maps. There was in the Saudi-Iraqi border. There was an area called the neutral zone, a little diamond-shaped area in the border, and I was flying real close to that, and I got hit with an SA-2 indication on my raw gear. Never saw a missile. I don't think anything ever got launched. But that was one of those. Wow, I didn't expect that to happen. And looking outside, no, nothing's happening there. Kind of pressed on. I've never really had anything from a threat standpoint other than that. There's no real credible air threat in Afghanistan. And then, since the Gulf War, there was never really much in the way of credible air threats in Iraq. Every now and then they would take a shot, with some kind of what we call a science project, just take a unguided shot and hoping they'd hit something. And to dive off on a quick story on that, we had one of the pilots here, absolute character, lived across the street from me on base, and there was an incident years ago in the 90s when the Iraqis took a science project shot, and it actually got fairly close to the U-2. Didn't damage him, but I think he saw the flash and maybe felt a little of the shockwave, but it got really close to him. They pretty lucky, and we really laughed because if you remember the book The Ransom of Red Chief, it was kind of a children's book, but we always laughed that had they shot him down, it would have been one of those. He would have made their life so miserable. They would have been paying us to please just take him back. He would have been inside their turn circle and making their life so miserable, and they wouldn't have known what to do with him. But digressing off I hadn't thought of that in a long time. But most concerned, one time. It was one of my very, very first. It was one of my early operational stories out of England, flying down the inter-German border, and there was part of the track where I was pretty much heading right at the German border, west to east, heading at the border, and I was going to hit it and do a nice, easy left turn. As I'm looking at them, we have these charts that are mounted on a 11 by 14 cardboard, and because it's easier to handle the chart there. You have them all pre-mounted. I'm looking at the chart. Okay, it'd be a right turn or a left turn. All of a sudden, the plane goes into this right turn. I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. Shouldn't be doing a right turn as the plane starts to continues to bank. I'm like, oh, I don't like that. So I grab the yoke and holding on to it. All of a sudden, the autopilot kicks off. You get the doo-doo-doo-doo, which lets you know the autopilot's off. So I kick off the autopilot and I grab the plane. The plane's starting to actually nose down and go into a dive. And I grab the yoke, kick it off, and I've got a ton of roll force to the right. Kick it off, and I've let the plane get 2 nose low, and the plane's already going into the Mach Buffet as we're going downhill. I'm already going through the speed, the max speed of the aircraft, the max book speed. I've oversped the aircraft, and there's a lot of roll force to the right. And it's kind of funny because at the time we carried a recorder on the aircraft, and you on the yoke on the right here, there's a trigger here, a little button, and you can push it. You can push it and record some stuff. Hey, I see, I got an indication of this, and this. Time now 11:43, and my position is this. And you could just make verbal notes to be processed. When you get on the ground, if you didn't have time to write it down. So I guess I grabbed the yoke, and the plane's going down, and I was going shit, and I guess I keyed the mic because they had that on the recorder when I got back. What had happened is I learned this lesson. I passed this on to the guys later. We have our tube food. It looks like a tube of toothpaste. And you have your tube food, you eat in your helmet. Well, I'd gotten a tube food out, and I wasn't going to eat it right away, but I already had it out, and I laid it up in the front left quadrant, right in front of the throttle. Well, right up there, if you look at a cockpit on the U-2 cockpit, there's an aileron trim. And you could push it left or push it right. And the tube food had fallen over onto the aileron trim, and it ran me full aileron trim to the right. And I guess it happened. I don't know when it happened, but at some point along the way, the autopilot went, "I'm out. I can't control this anymore." And that was when everything kicked off, and the autopilot rolled over and and I was grabbing an aircraft, which I thought was a flight control problem. I felt it. And after I got the airplane under control and everything, I looked down, and there's this tube of toothpaste or tube of tube food laying on the aileron trim mechanism, and got everything trimmed back out, and everything was fine. Didn't hurt the airplane, fortunately. But that was a few seconds of like, holy smokes, man! This really got my attention. I mentioned earlier in the interview about the near mishap I had. That was the closest I've ever come to wrecking a U-2 when we had the misrigged flaps when I was a new guy. And I'd say most of the stuff that I've had has happened has been because of the sheer small window we fly in. If it deviates out of that window, like in the T-38, you've got a huge range of speed you can fly, and F-15, C-17, probably a huge range you can fly in this aircraft. The U-2, you kind of get outside the little tiny window there, and things get exciting pretty quick. So I could roll through a number of stories. I won't bore you with them right now, but all of them involve usually just letting myself get outside that little operating envelope of the U-2 usually due to weather conditions, turbulence, autopilot failure due to the turbulence, something like that.
Do you? So this is, I think, sort of most problematic, very high, isn't it? So, and it's the difference between the fastest you can go before getting into the Mach buffet and the slowest you can go before stalling. And
exactly.
that is a few knots of margin. Is that correct?
It's actually more. It's apparently in the C model, the smaller aircraft, the window is a lot smaller. In our aircraft, it's actually it's a lot larger. It's a lot larger window than people think. But when you do look at it on paper, it's like, yeah, it's small. You're operating in maybe six knots to your overspeed, and 6-7 knots like that. But it is one of those things that it's manageable, and you look at it and then you train to it and you do it. You ask anybody flying fighters when they first get there, it's like, holy smokes, this is pretty intense. But then they train to it and they do it very, very, very well. Flying C-17s, the crazy stuff they do on forward deployed things in the C-17. I've had those guys describe it to me, and I think to myself, wow, that sounds like a big challenge. But we have training programs that train you to it. So it's you like anything else, you get used to it, and you respect the end of the envelope, and you work your best not to exceed it.
So where is the U-2 most? I don't want to say dangerous because that's quite an emotive term, but I remember just being here in the UK, a TR1 crashing on takeoff, and I think the pilot ejected, but didn't make it. And there was fairly recently, within the last few years, there was the two-seater that crashed in Northern California. What are the things that catch people out then?
Yeah, I don't know what our accident rate is now, but years ago we had probably the highest accident rate, Class A mishap rate of the U.S. Air Force fleet. Don't know what it is now. That's been a while. The mishap you alluded to in the UK, that was actually 25 years ago this year. It was August of 1995, if I remember right. 25 years at Fairford. If you're talking about that one, okay. I guess. Yeah, boy, what's the most dangerous? Statistically, most of the mishaps have involved wearing the pressure suit. The one that we had 3-4 years ago, the two-seater, did not. But if you go back and look at most of the Class A mishaps, aircraft that were destroyed in a mishap, almost everything involved flying in the pressure suit. Why is that? I don't know. But because we fly a ton of flights around the flagpole at Beale Air Force Base, doing a lot of training with a lot of folks that are they're experienced aviators, but they're not experienced in the U-2. But that's relatively safe statistically. But as far as my perspective as somebody who's flown the airplane a while, the mission, everybody thinks of the mission as being fairly benign. You get there, you drive down the black line, and not much is happening. But it's very fatiguing. There's the physiological effects of the high altitude and breathing pure oxygen for that period of time. Your body, at least when I was flying it, your body was sitting at the top of Mount Everest. You're 29,000 foot cabin altitude. That has changed in the last 8-9 years or so. They've modified all the cockpits. Now you're only flying at about 14,000 foot on your body. They've cut it. They've increased the cockpit pressure and lowered the altitude down. But the fatigue issues, any fatigue study you look at, you're your performance goes down dramatically after you cross certain thresholds of number of hours on duty. So I think a lot of it is people see the mission as being, not much going on there, but there's a fair amount of risk going out there, not having a wingman or somebody else in the cockpit to monitor you. And as my professional job, I fly, in a two-person cockpit, and there's been plenty of times in my brief time as a professional commercial pilot where having that second person has been very, 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 very helpful and kept us out of, increasingly risky, not risky, but that we've mitigated the risk because there are two of us. You just don't have that when you're flying the U-2, and you can be flying the U-2 and in a 10-hour mission. By the time you show up and put the suit on and get going, you could be feeling good, and the cold and the flu develops over the course of that. You suddenly find yourself coming back, sick. They come back early because you're sick, and so nobody to really help you out there. But operating in the suit is definitely you just lose a little bit of essay when you're operating in the suit, especially early on. So you learn to, as I mentioned earlier, turn to shake hands with the suit and learn to go through this relationship for the next few years with the pressure suit, and learn to love each other. But early on, it can be quite a challenge.
What did you do then once you come back from Alconbury? Did you? I mean, do you fly the U-2 all the way through, or is there some ground tour? Or
yeah, my quick history. So, a year of pilot training, and then 3 years flying the T-38 as an instructor pilot at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. Beale for 6 months for training, and then off to Alconbury for 3 years and 3 months. They decided they were going to close the unit down at Alconbury. This is spring of '93. I left in June of '93. They decided to keep it open there for another year, and they backfilled it with detachment pilots coming in from Beale. But the permanent party we all left in '93 because I was under a unit closure at the time. The Air Force gave us the option somewhat of where we wanted to go. Beale wanted me to come back, and I had burned out a little bit after flying the U-2 for 4 years, and I wanted to go back and fly the T-38 at the instructor schoolhouse in Texas at Randolph Air Force Base. So if you're going to become a pilot training instructor, you go to the schoolhouse for a 3-month course, learn how to be an instructor, and then you go out to the pilot training base. Well, I'd done the pilot training base thing for 3 years. I wanted to go teach in the school in the instructor schoolhouse, and I applied for or asked to go there, and I got that. So for 3 years, I went back there and flew the T-38 as an instructor, if you will. And after about 2 years of that, it was great, but I thought, I really am missing the U-2 program, missing the people, missing flying the aircraft. So I'd kind of gotten through the burnout, if you will, and asked to come back to the U-2. And at that time, I got promoted to major. And they said, if you get promoted to major, we'll take you back. If you get passed over, we'll have to talk about it. I got promoted to major. And at the end of my tour there, I ran off back to Beale in '96. Flew at Beale from '96 until 2000. And by then, I had just shy of 15 years in the Air Force, and I elected to get out of the Air Force and moved back to Texas as a civilian, working as a commercial airline pilot. And I was on a trip in Chicago. I'm standing there at the gate waiting for the plane came there, and all the people are getting off the aircraft, and I'm waiting around, waiting to go do the pre-flight, and off comes a couple of people. I look at him, I kind of recognize him from Beale, and then one of my really good friends, Dean Neely, comes off the aircraft. I'm like, "Hey, Gucci." He's like, "Hey." I'm like, "What are you guys doing?" He goes, "Oh, we're getting back from a deployment." I said, "Where'd you go?" He said, "Sorry, can't tell you." And I thought, man, I really miss this stuff. And this is when is it? This is like spring of '01. And so I got back home. I thought about it, and I started talking to my wife. I said, "Hey, what do you think about going back in the Air Force?" She's like, "You made your bed. You got to sleep in it. We're not doing that." So I still went in, got online, and made a few phone calls. I called back to the squadron, talked to the squadron commander, Spike Gentili. I said, "Hey, Spike, sir, I'd like to maybe come back to the U-2. Would you take me back?" And he said, "Yeah, if you decide to come back, let us know. We'll bring you back in the U-2 program." So I got the application from the Air Force on coming back on active. I got it all filled out on my desk over time, and I had it all filled out, ready to go. And I lived 10 minutes from Randolph Air Force Base, which is where the Air Force Personnel Center. I was going to hand walk this thing in and go through the process. And I've been working with my wife on it. She was kind of rolling her eyes thinking about it. Had it sitting on my desk, and I went out and flew my next airline trip, and that was, I think, September 9th, 2001.
Wow.
So went out and flew my, day 1, day 2 or whatever. And on September 11th of 2001, I was airborne going from Kansas City to Chicago when 9/11 went down. And we landed in Chicago. I spent 5 days stuck in Chicago. And when things started to open back up, I was on the first flight that went from Chicago back into San Antonio on around the 16th, 17th, somewhere in there of September. Waited a couple of days, saw the writing on the wall, gathered my application up. Security was a little bit tighter on the base, and I can't remember how I did it. I had an ID card somehow, but I was able to get myself on the base and hand walked my application to come back on active duty into the Air Force. And dropped it off. And then I started politicking on the side to get requalified in the T-38 through going to Randolph, because I didn't have to sell my house, move on back. And there was a T-30. Beale didn't have a training slot for me, but I was able to make a few phone calls, and I was able to get a slot into to go to Randolph as a Pitt student. I'd been a Pitt instructor, but now I'm going to go back and go through the qualification course as a student. So it was a screamingly good deal, and the course started on November 19th, 2001. And so I've got my application in, and they approved my application for the next step. I went down, I got my medical, and I had that done probably by end of September. And I would call up their personnel center. Hey, I've got this date, November 19th, to start Pitt, the pilot instructor training course. We're waiting on your medical results. Call a week later. What's going on? Medical results. So as we started to get in around the 1st of November, I started to get a little concerned. I start tracking. And so finally, about a week prior to me showing up, I'm literally driving down every day to the personnel center saying, I'm starting here. What about? Well, we're waiting on your medical results. And on the Friday prior to me starting, I think it was November 19th. I think it was a Monday. A Friday, I go into the personnel center in the afternoon. They're like, "Sorry, we don't have it. We can't bring you on." I said, "I don't care." So the next Monday morning, I had kind of grown a goatee. I threw on some nice clothes and a tie, and I showed up to academics as a civilian at Randolph Air Force Base. I walked in the class, and the instructors all knew me. Like, "Hey, what are you doing here?" I'm like, "I'm just going to sit through and audit the class." Really? Yep. Okay. So I sat through academics, as Mr. John Huggins. I went through the systems academics for a few days, and then we finished academics. Any orders? Nothing yet. Fine. If the Air Force can't find a way to get me on active duty yet, I'll continue to go through the course, but I won't be able to find my razor either. So I show up in the squadron with a full goatee and dressed very nice. I wore a sport coat every day and slacks, and I sat through all the preliminary missions we did. Now, they wouldn't let me do any flying. They wouldn't let me do any simulators. I mean, those cost money, but anything that was a briefing, I sat through and did as much as I could. And sure enough, a few weeks later, medical got approved and I got my orders, and I was able to continue. Actually, they let me continue on in that class because they hadn't got me. I'd done all the preliminary stuff, and I wasn't really but a couple days behind on the simulators. So I was basically up to speed and on track, and it all worked out really, really well. Finished that up in March or April of 2002. And then went right back to Beale Air Force Base. Showed up there as a qualified T-38 instructor pilot, and went through my U-2 requal. And I was at Beale from 2002 until I retired in late 2014. So a nice 12-year stretch, minus 1 year when I was yanked out of the program over to the MC-12 King Air variant. Went over to Afghanistan. I was over there for about 7 months. I spent about 12, 13 months in the MC-12 program until I was able to claw my way back into the program I loved the most, which was the U-2, and was back into the U-2 for a while. So some funny, good sub stories in there we can dive into later, but that was kind of my career progression.